It was a crisp autumn morning in the quiet town of Maplewood. The air was filled with the scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of lawnmowers. I, Chief Daniel Harper, was sitting on my porch, savoring my first cup of coffee. The tranquility of the morning was something I cherished, especially after decades of dealing with the chaos of law enforcement. But as I took that first sip, my peace was shattered by the sound of hurried footsteps and the unmistakable clatter of something being dragged across the pavement. I peered over the edge of my porch, my eyes narrowing as I saw a figure darting down the street. It was Margaret Maggie Thompson, a woman known throughout the neighborhood for her nosy demeanor and self-righteous attitude. She was clutching something under her arm, something that looked suspiciously like my prized garden gnome, Gerald. Gerald wasn't just any garden gnome. He was a family heirloom, passed down from my grandfather, and the centerpiece of my front yard. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a petty theft. This was personal. I set my coffee down and sprang into action, my years of police training kicking in. "Maggie," I called out, my voice firm but controlled. "What do you think you're doing with Gerald?" She froze, her shoulders tensing as she turned to face me. Her expression shifted from surprise to defiance in an instant. "This thing," she scoffed, holding up Gerald as if he were a piece of trash. "It's an eyesore, Daniel. I'm doing the neighborhood a favor by getting rid of it." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check. "That eyesore is mine, Maggie. Put it back." She rolled her eyes, her lips curling into a smug smile. "Oh, please. You're the police chief. Shouldn't you be out solving real crimes instead of obsessing over some tacky lawn ornament?" Her words stung, but I refused to let her get under my skin. "This is a real crime, Maggie. You're stealing my property. Put it down, or I'll have no choice but to call this in." For a moment, she hesitated, her bravado wavering. But then, as if realizing she had an audience, several neighbors had begun to gather. Drawn by the commotion, she doubled down. "Go ahead, call the police," she sneered. "I'll tell them how you've been harassing me for weeks. Who do you think they'll believe? The respected police chief or the poor, defenseless woman just trying to beautify the neighborhood?" I felt a chill run down my spine. Maggie was notorious for twisting the truth to suit her narrative, and I knew she wouldn't hesitate to play the victim if it meant saving face. But I wasn't about to let her get away with this. I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency line, my eyes never leaving hers. Within minutes, a squad car pulled up and two of my officers, Officer Ramirez and Officer Jenkins, stepped out. They immediately recognized me and approached with cautious expressions. "Chief Harper," Ramirez said, nodding respectfully. "What's going on here?" Before I could respond, Maggie launched into her performance. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she cried, her voice dripping with faux distress. "This man has been harassing me for weeks, and now he's accusing me of stealing some ridiculous garden gnome. I was just trying to clean up the neighborhood." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "Officers, this is my property," I said, gesturing to Gerald, who was still clutched in Maggie's arms. "I witnessed her taking it from my yard. This isn't about neighborhood beautification, it's theft." Ramirez and Jenkins exchanged glances, clearly weighing the situation. "Ma'am," Jenkins said, turning to Maggie, "can you provide any proof that this gnome belongs to you?" Maggie's confidence faltered for the first time. I thought it was abandoned," she stammered. "It's been sitting there for weeks, looking all neglected. I was just trying to help." "Help?" I interjected, my voice rising slightly. "By stealing my family heirloom? That's not helping, Maggie. That's theft." The officers nodded, their expressions hardening as they turned back to Maggie. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come down to the station with us," Ramirez said firmly. "We'll sort this out there." Maggie's face turned pale, her earlier bravado evaporating. "You can't be serious," she protested. "This is ridiculous. I'm a pillar of this community." "And yet," Jenkins replied, his tone dry, "you're the one holding stolen property. Let's go." As they led Maggie to the squad car, I felt a mix of relief and vindication. But I knew this wasn't over. Maggie wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and I had a feeling she'd try to turn this situation to her advantage. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and neighborhood gossip. Maggie, true to form, tried to spin the narrative in her favor, claiming that I had been targeting her for months, and that the garden gnome incident was just the latest in a series of unwarranted attacks. But the evidence was against her. Security footage from my home clearly showed her taking Gerald from my yard, and several neighbors came forward to testify about her history of meddling and entitlement. The case went to court, and I found myself sitting in the front row, my stomach churning with a mix of anxiety and determination. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers, many of whom had their own stories about Maggie's antics. As the judge entered, a hush fell over the room. Maggie, dressed in a tailored suit and wearing an expression of wounded innocence, took the stand. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling with faux emotion, "I was only trying to make our neighborhood a better place. This whole thing has been blown out of proportion." But the prosecutor wasn't having it. "Your Honor, this isn't about neighborhood improvement. This is about theft and manipulation. Ms. Thompson not only stole Chief Harper's property, but also attempted to file a false police report against him." The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. When it was my turn to testify, I recounted the events of that morning with clarity and precision, describing how I had seen Maggie take Gerald and the subsequent confrontation that followed. The prosecutor presented the security footage and witness statements, painting a damning picture of Maggie's actions. As the evidence piled up, Maggie's confidence began to crumble. Her attempts to sway the court's sympathy only backfired, and by the end of the trial, the verdict was clear: guilty on both counts of theft and filing a false police report. The judge sentenced Maggie to 6 months of community service, specifically requiring her to tend to the gardens of elderly residents in the neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had tried to beautify the neighborhood by stealing was now being forced to do so through hard labor. Over the next few months, I watched as Maggie carried out her sentence. At first, she approached the task with obvious disdain, rolling her eyes and muttering under her breath as she mowed lawns and pruned hedges. But as time went on, something began to change. I noticed it one afternoon as I was walking through the neighborhood. Maggie was kneeling in Mrs. Henderson's garden, carefully planting flowers while the elderly woman chatted away. There was a softness in Maggie's expression that I hadn't seen before, a hint of humility that had been buried beneath years of entitlement. By the end of her community service, Maggie had not only transformed the gardens of Maplewood, but also her own demeanor. She began to form genuine connections with the people she had once looked down upon, learning their stories and sharing her own. It was as if the act of serving others had chipped away at the walls she had built around herself. When her sentence was finally over, Maggie approached me one evening as I was sitting on my porch. "Daniel," she said, her voice quiet but sincere, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong, about Gerald, about you, about everything. I see that now." I nodded, accepting her apology with a sense of closure. "We all make mistakes, Maggie. What matters is what we do to make them right." As she walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just in the justice that had been served, but in the unexpected redemption that had come from it. The stolen garden gnome had become a symbol of something far greater: the power of accountability, humility, and the possibility of change. And as I sat there, watching the sun set over Maplewood, I realized that sometimes the smallest actions can lead to the most profound transformations. Months had passed since Maggie's sentencing, and the neighborhood of Maplewood had settled back into its usual rhythm. The hum of lawnmowers and the chatter of neighbors filled the air, and life seemed to return to normal. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Maggie's fall from grace and subsequent redemption had left a lasting impact on the community, and her story had become a cautionary tale, and, surprisingly, a source of inspiration. Maggie, now free from her community service obligations, had become a different person. She no longer strutted through the neighborhood with her nose in the air, casting judgment on everyone's choices. Instead, she walked with a quiet humility, often stopping to chat with the elderly residents she had once dismissed. She had even started a small gardening club, offering free lessons to anyone interested in learning how to tend to their yards. One Saturday morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I noticed Maggie setting up a table at the end of the street. She had a sign that read, "Free gardening tips. Ask me anything." A small crowd had gathered, curious neighbors eager to learn from the woman who had once been the subject of so much gossip. I decided to walk over, curious to see how she was handling her newfound role as the neighborhood's unofficial gardening guru. As I approached, Maggie looked up and smiled. A genuine smile, not the forced one she used to wear. "Daniel," she said, her voice warm. "I'm glad you came. I was hoping you'd stop by." "I couldn't resist," I replied, glancing at the table, which was covered with gardening tools, seed packets, and a stack of handwritten notes. "You've really thrown yourself into this, haven't you?" She nodded, her eyes shining with a sense of purpose. "It's funny, isn't it? All this started because of a stupid garden gnome. But now, I feel like I've found something I'm actually good at. Something that helps people." I couldn't help but smile. "You've come a long way, Maggie. I'm proud of you." Her smile widened, and for a moment, it felt like the old animosity between us had melted away. But as I turned to leave, she called after me. "Daniel, wait. There's something I need to tell you." I paused, turning back to face her. "What is it?" She hesitated, her expression suddenly serious. "It's about why I took Gerald that day. It wasn't just because I thought he was an eyesore. There's more to it." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I was jealous," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jealous of you, of your position in the community, of the respect everyone had for you. I thought if I could take something that mattered to you, it would, I don't know, level the playing field." I stared at her, stunned. "Maggie, I had no idea." She shook her head, her eyes downcast. "I know it sounds ridiculous now, but back then, I was so consumed by my own insecurities that I couldn't see how petty I was being. I'm sorry, Daniel. Truly." I placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We all have our moments, Maggie. What matters is that you've grown from it. And for what it's worth, I think you've earned the respect you were so desperate for." She looked up at me, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." Just when it seemed like peace had returned to Maplewood, a new disturbance arose. Over the next few weeks, reports began to surface of petty thefts around the neighborhood, lawn ornaments disappearing, garden tools going missing, and even a few broken windows. At first, it seemed like random acts of vandalism, but as the incidents piled up, a pattern began to emerge. The thefts were happening in the same areas where Maggie had been carrying out her community service. Suspicion quickly turned toward her, and whispers began to spread. Had she truly changed, or was this all an act? Even I found myself questioning her motives. One evening, as I was reviewing the reports at the police station, Officer Ramirez approached me. "Chief, we've got a problem," he said, his tone grim. "Another theft last night. This time, it was Mrs. Henderson's prized rose bushes. She's devastated." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Any leads?" Ramirez hesitated, then said, "There's footage from a security camera nearby. It's not great quality, but it looks like Maggie was in the area around the time of the theft." My heart sank. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I know it's hard to believe, Chief, but we have to consider the possibility." I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Maggie had seemed so genuine in her transformation. Could she really have gone back to her old ways? Or was there something else going on? I decided to pay Maggie a visit the next morning. When I arrived at her house, I found her in the backyard, tending to a row of freshly planted flowers. She looked up as I approached, her expression wary. "Daniel," she said, brushing dirt off her hands. "What brings you here?" I crossed my arms, studying her carefully. "We need to talk, Maggie. There's been a string of thefts in the neighborhood, and your name keeps coming up." Her eyes widened in shock. "What? You think I had something to do with it?" "I don't want to think that," I said honestly. "But the evidence is pointing in your direction. I need to hear your side of the story." She shook her head vehemently. "I swear, Daniel, I had nothing to do with it. I've been trying to turn my life around. Why would I risk everything I've built?" I wanted to believe her, but the evidence was hard to ignore. "Then why were you seen near Mrs. Henderson's house the night her rose bushes were stolen?" Maggie's face paled. I was there," she admitted. "But not to steal anything. I was meeting someone." "Who?" I pressed. She hesitated, then sighed. "It's my nephew, Tommy. He's been staying with me for the past few weeks. He's been going through a rough patch, and I thought I could help him. But I think he might be involved in these thefts." I frowned, processing this new information. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I didn't want to believe it, she said, her voice breaking. I thought if I could talk to him, get him to stop, but I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I placed a hand on her shoulder, my tone softening. Maggie, you need to bring him in. We can help him, but only if he's willing to take responsibility for his actions. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll talk to him. I promise. That evening, Maggie brought Tommy to the police station. He was a scrawny teenager with a defiant look in his eyes, but as Maggie explained the situation, his bravado began to crumble. I didn't mean to cause trouble, he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. I wanted to impress some friends. They dared me to steal stuff, and I thought it would be funny. I leaned forward, my expression stern. Tommy, this isn't a game. You've caused a lot of pain and damage. But if you're willing to make things right, we can work something out. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'll do whatever it takes. With Tommy's cooperation, we were able to recover most of the stolen items and return them to their rightful owners. Maggie, true to her word, stood by her nephew throughout the process, offering him the support and guidance he so desperately needed. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood of Maplewood came together in a way I hadn't seen in years. Maggie's gardening club grew in popularity, and she became a trusted figure in the community once again, not because of her status, but because of her genuine efforts to make amends. Tommy, too, began to turn his life around. With Maggie's guidance and the support of the community, he started volunteering at a local youth center, using his experiences to help other troubled teens. As for me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in how far we'd all come. The stolen garden gnome had been the catalyst for a series of events that had tested us, challenged us, and ultimately brought us closer together. One evening, as I sat on my porch, watching the sun set over Maplewood, Maggie approached with a small potted plant in her hands. For you, she said, handing it to me with a smile. Consider it a thank you for everything. I accepted the plant, feeling a sense of closure. Thank you, Maggie, for reminding us all that it's never too late to change. As she walked away, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey we'd been through. The stolen garden gnome had been more than just an object. It had been a symbol of our struggles, our growth, and our capacity for redemption. And as the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky, I knew that Maplewood was stronger than ever, not in spite of our challenges, but because of them. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.